How do you forget a battle? How does a nation send 6 men to their deaths beside a jungle creek? Watch 20 more cut down by shrapnel and rockets in 4 hours of monsoon rain, and then simply move on. The 7th Battalion Royal Australian Regiment fought one of the most tactically extraordinary engagements of the entire Australian involvement in Vietnam on the 6th of August, 1967. They fought an enemy so skilled, so disciplined, so identically trained that the official after-action report used a phrase that should stop you cold. Their tactics were similar to our own. 8 soldiers received gallantry awards. The American commander of the entire Vietnam War tried to give one Australian sergeant the highest military decoration the United States has ever created, and was told it was impossible. Tell me in the comments, had you heard the name Suoi Chau Pha before today? Because what you are about to discover is not a story about overwhelming odds or miraculous survival. It is something rarer than that. It is the story of 2 perfectly matched armies meeting by chance in a monsoon, and of what it costs when neither side will break. Stay until the end. The last name I mention will stay with you. To understand what happened beside that jungle creek, you must first understand the world that created it, the disaster, and that is the right word for what preceded the battle, even if the battle itself ended in Australian victory, was not born from the mistake of a single officer. It grew from a collision between 2 nations' ideas about how a war should be fought, and from the particular cruelty of a system that decided by lottery which young men would pay the price for that collision. The men who died beside the Suoi Chau Pha did not die because their officers made a tactical error in the jungle. They died because someone in an office far from the jungle had decided, with the full confidence of a man who had never been wrong before, that the enemy they were about to encounter was no longer there. Australia's national service scheme had been running since 1965. The mechanism was almost theatrical in its randomness. A barrel, a collection of marbles, each representing a birthday. 2 draws per year. If your birthday came up, you went. Over 800,000 men registered across the life of the scheme. 63,000 were conscripted. More than 19,000 served in Vietnam. Private Barlife Harstad, his mates called him Leaf, had his birthday drawn from that barrel. So did Private David Milford. Neither man had asked for this war. Neither man had volunteered for it, or sought it, or signed any document inviting it into their lives. Both would be dead before their 22nd birthdays, killed beside a stream in Phuoc Tuy province by an enemy their headquarters had officially decided was no longer there. The system that sent them had no mechanism for apology. It simply moved on to the next draw. The strategic picture in Phuoc Tuy province by mid-1967 appeared, to those reading the intelligence summaries in the offices at Nui Dat and beyond, to be one of quiet and consolidating success. The Battle of Long Tan, the previous August, had been a defining moment. 18 Australians dead, 245 Viet Cong killed, a single company holding off a full regiment with artillery support until reinforcements arrived. David against Goliath, and David had won decisively. In the months that followed, the enemy seemed to dissolve into the landscape. Bunkers were found empty. Supply caches were destroyed. The main roads were reopened. Operation Paddington in July of 1967, a massive joint American-Australian operation involving nearly 15,000 troops, had swept through the Hat Dich area, northwest of Nui Dat, and found almost nothing worth fighting. Camps, storage areas, supply lines that had been disrupted, but no sustained contact, no regiment anywhere on the ground. The officers writing the intelligence assessments used words like diminished and dispersed and possibly relocated. They were confident words. Confidence in this war was frequently the most dangerous thing a man could carry into the jungle. The commander of the 1st Australian Task Force, Brigadier Stuart Graham, began to speculate openly that the Viet Cong might have abandoned Phuoc Toi province altogether. A succession of operations in the southeast had restricted enemy movement, and Graham reasoned that no sizable threat remained to the populated areas of the province. The barrier minefield had been completed. The highway to Xuyen Mak in the east had been reopened. The 275th Regiment had reportedly moved north to War Zone D for retraining and refitting after the heavy casualties it sustained at Long Tan. The enemy had given up, it appeared. The enemy had gone home. They had not. They had stopped being visible, which is an entirely different thing, and the distinction would cost A Company dearly on the morning of the 6th of August. This was the fundamental misreading that would send those men into the jungle without knowing what was waiting for them. The Viet Cong 274th Regiment, part of the Viet Cong 5th Division under the overall command of Senior Colonel Nguyen the Truyen, had not fled Phuoc Tuy. It had dispersed, reconsolidated, and repositioned with the patient efficiency of a force that had been fighting this kind of war for 2 decades and understood better than anyone that the side which remained invisible retained every advantage. Australian Signals Intelligence had tracked the regiment by its radio transmitter as it moved in mid-July 1967. Then the transmitter went quiet, or changed frequency, or moved beyond the range of the receivers. The intelligence officers lost the signal and made a note in the file. The regiment vanished from every map in every headquarters in the province. For the purposes of Operation Ballarat's planning, the 274th Regiment did not exist. The operational orders made no provision for encountering it. The companies moving into the Hat Dich on foot in the first days of August 1967 were not briefed to expect a main force regiment. They were briefed to expect rear echelon logistics units, work parties repairing bunkers, and small groups moving supplies. They were going hunting for mice. The cat had been there the whole time. The intelligence was wrong by approximately 900 meters. There was a second friction running beneath the operation, one that had been accumulating for years and had finally reached the point where it was being felt in formal communications between senior commanders. The Australians and the Americans approached this war as if they were fighting 2 entirely different conflicts on the same piece of ground, and in many ways they were. General William Westmoreland, commander of United States Military Assistance Command Vietnam, had in early 1967 formally complained to Major General Tim Vincent, Commander Australian Forces Vietnam, demanding that the Australians adopt a more aggressive posture. More operations, bigger sweeps, higher body counts. The American doctrine of attrition required visible results that could be reported in numbers. Body counts. Territory cleared. Operations mounted. The Australians were convinced that these metrics measured the wrong things entirely. Deliberate patrolling techniques, counterinsurgency work, the slow and patient extension of government control through population security, and the gradual separation of communist forces from the villages they depended on for food, intelligence, and recruits. These were the methods that would win in Phuoc Tuy, not the methods that looked impressive in a weekly report to Washington. The Australians largely held their course. Their patience, they believed, was their greatest tactical advantage. Westmoreland complained again. The Australians nodded and continued doing what they had been doing. Operation Ballarat was designed in exactly that spirit of deliberate, unhurried patience. Lieutenant Colonel Eric Smith, commanding officer of the 7th Battalion, planned the operation to move entirely by foot. No helicopter insertion. Helicopter assault was faster, but it announced itself from kilometers away. Every Viet Cong fighter in earshot of a landing zone knew that Australians were coming, knew roughly where they were coming from, and had between 15 minutes and an hour to decide what to do about it. Foot movement was slower. It was harder on the men. It meant carrying everything they needed for 5 days on their backs through primary jungle in the wet season. But it was silent. Smith's concept called for the rifle companies to establish patrol bases and develop ambush positions over 12 days of careful, methodical work. Stealth was the entire point. Stealth was the weapon. For the first 2 days, the plan worked brilliantly. A company had been in the jungle since the 3rd of August. On the evening of the 5th, they required resupply. Rather than call in a standard logistics flight, Smith used the insertion technique perfected by the Special Air Service Regiment for operations requiring maximum concealment. 4 Iroquois helicopters arrived in darkness, dropped their loads precisely, and departed before their sound could carry to any enemy position within earshot. The entire resupply was completed in 2 minutes and 40 seconds. The helicopters were gone before any Viet Cong sentry could triangulate their position. The operation remained undetected. The plan was working. No one yet knew what was waiting on the other side of the creek. The men who carried this plan into the jungle were not, in any straightforward sense, a professional army in the traditional mold. They were a mixture of regular soldiers who had chosen soldiering as a career and national servicemen who had not. Private Leif Harstad sat down 4 days before the battle and wrote a letter to his parents. His section commander was on guard duty in Saigon. His second-in-command was in hospital with a skin disease. The leadership of his section had devolved by the arithmetic of military necessity to Harstad himself, a private, a conscript, a 21-year-old whose birthday had come up in the lottery barrel. He wrote home with the quiet confidence of a young man who had decided to be adequate to whatever came next. He mentioned the operation ahead. He mentioned that the lieutenant thought he could handle it. He mentioned his upcoming officer training, which he was looking forward to. He signed off and sent the letter north. His parents would never receive another one. They would spend the rest of their lives carrying the knowledge of what his last letter contained and what it could not have known and what came after. Private Barry Hurd was a company's radio operator. He had trained at Pukapunyal in Victoria and at the Jungle Warfare Training Center at Canungra in Queensland. Arrived in Vietnam with the 7th Battalion in April 1967, and by early August was carrying the company command net radio through the jungle with his antenna trimmed short to avoid snagging the canopy above him. He was 20 years old. He had grown up in rural Victoria. He had never been in combat. By his own later account, written decades after the events it describes, he had no real idea what he was getting himself into when the company crossed the Suoi Chau Pha on the morning of the 6th. He would spend the rest of his life trying to write about that day, not because he chose to, but because the day would not release him regardless of how far he walked from it. On the morning of the 6th, Major Ewart O'Donnell moved his company toward their intended patrol base. Second Lieutenant Graham Ross commanded 2 platoon, the lead element. The jungle was primary canopy, dense triple-layer vegetation that compressed midday into a dim greenish twilight and reduced visibility to between 10 and 40 meters, depending on whether you were lying flat or standing. The ground was saturated from weeks of monsoon rainfall. Everything smelled of damp earth and rotting vegetation, and the particular heaviness of air that has nowhere to move beneath a continuous ceiling of leaves. At 10:40 in the morning, 2 platoons crossed a creek, the Suoi Chau Pha. The name is unremarkable in Vietnamese. It is simply a stream in a province full of streams, a crease in the terrain that appeared on operational maps as a thin blue line, and in person as dark water running between overhanging roots and trailing vines. Corporal Gordon Tredria's section crossed the water and found, on the northern bank, a track. The footprints in the mud were fresh, the earth still wet and compressed where boots had pressed it minutes earlier, not hours earlier. Minutes. Tredria waved his men into ambush positions astride the track without a word, without a signal beyond the gesture, and the section moved into the jungle on either side and became part of it. Visibility at ground level was 10 meters. A man standing 3 trees away would see nothing. The section held still, and the sounds of deliberate movement ceased, and what was left was distant water and the breathing of men who had practiced making themselves invisible until the practice had become instinct. Lieutenant Neville Clark, the company's artillery forward observer, later wrote in his diary that in the minutes before contact, time stood still. He was not reaching for poetry. He was describing a physiological reality. In the jungle, at the moment before violence, the world acquires a quality of absolute attention that soldiers who have experienced it describe identically in every language, in every war. The body understands what is coming before the mind has finished processing the evidence. The body waits. 2 Viet Cong sentries came along the track from the west. They were walking without urgency, their weapons slung across their backs, talking quietly to each other, as men do when they believe they are alone and safe and in familiar territory. Nothing in any intelligence report they had seen suggested that Australians were operating this deep in the Hat Dich. Nothing in the operational picture available to their battalion that morning indicated that the situation had changed since the previous day. They strolled into the killing ground with not a care in the world. Within a second, they had none. Tredrea and the forward scout shot both men simultaneously. The machine gunner put a burst in for good measure. The 2 sentries died before they registered that something was wrong. The ambush had worked exactly as designed. That was the last thing that would go exactly as designed for the next 4 hours. Major O'Donnell assessed the situation with the speed of a professional who had trained for this for years. 2 men are rarely alone. The presence of a fresh, well-used track deep in the Hat Dich meant this was not a random patrol. Something significant was operating in the area, and O'Donnell intended to find out what it was with the minimum possible compromise of his company's position. He ordered Lieutenant Clark to fix artillery from the 106th Field Battery at a cutoff position to block the most likely enemy escape routes to the west and north. He ordered 2 platoons to sweep forward along the track axis, find the remainder of what he assessed as a small group, and deal with them. He held 1 and 3 platoons back and waiting in positions from which they could react quickly to whatever the sweep produced. The company was in good order, moving well, operating exactly as trained. The sweep began. 40 meters, 60 meters, 100 meters along the track axis through the jungle. Then, from the northwest, from the darkness under the canopy where nothing was supposed to be, came the sound that every infantryman in primary jungle feared above all others. The opening burst of a light machine gun, heavy and sustained, followed immediately by several more, followed by the rapid crack of AK-47 assault rifles on automatic. Lieutenant Clark would later describe each rifle as sounding like a light machine gun on its own. The combined effect, a wall of noise that bypassed conscious thought entirely and landed somewhere below it, in the place where the body makes decisions before the mind catches up. 2 platoon hit the ground. The enemy force was not a small group, not a squad, not a patrol. C-12 Company of the 3rd Battalion, 274th Viet Cong Regiment, had also been moving through the area. The regiment that Australian intelligence had lost a month earlier had been operating from a battalion camp less than a kilometer to the north, a battalion camp the size of a small village, a camp that 100 Australians had been moving toward for 2 days without knowing it existed. C-12 Company, with the battalion's reconnaissance platoon, had been moving south through the Hat Dich that morning. The Australians had been moving north. Neither side had known the other was coming. Neither side had planned for this moment. Both sides had trained for it their entire military lives. What followed was not a massacre, and not an ambush, and not a tactical disaster in any simple sense. It was something rarer and more terrible. 2 forces of nearly identical size, nearly identical training, and nearly identical firepower, each reaching for the same tactical solution at the same moment, meeting head-on in the Monsoon jungle. The official after-action report would later state it with the clinical economy of a document that has no time for drama. Both companies deployed to the high ground at around the same time in a bid to outflank the other. That sentence contains a battle. Both sides went for the same ridge. Both sides arrived at the same time. Both sides were equally surprised and equally prepared and equally unwilling to give ground. The Viet Cong commander's response to the initial contact was immediate and professional. While one squad held the Australians in front with heavy automatic fire, 2 more squads moved left toward the high ground on the eastern flank. Second Lieutenant Graham Ross, reading from the same tactical manual as his enemy and arriving at the same conclusion simultaneously, ordered 2 of his sections right toward the same high ground, while his 3rd section provided fire support. Both assault groups reached the ridgeline at approximately the same moment. They found each other at 20 to 30 meters, close enough to distinguish faces, close enough to throw grenades with accuracy, too close for either side to disengage without catastrophic exposure to the other's fire. This was the moment the Viet Cong's counter-doctrine for fighting Australians became a physical reality that the men beside the creek could feel in their bodies. The enemy called it grabbing the belt buckle. The principle was devastating in its simplicity. Stay so close to the Australians that their greatest advantage, the immense weight of artillery and air power they could bring to bear on any fixed enemy position, became useless. At 20 meters, no pilot could safely drop ordnance without killing the men he was trying to support. At 30 meters, even the most accurate howitzers in the world required a margin of safety that the situation did not permit. The 274th Regiment had studied Australian tactics, identified the dependency on indirect fire as the structural foundation of Australian doctrine, and built a counter-doctrine specifically designed to neutralize it, close the distance, hug the enemy, make the artillery a liability instead of an asset. At the Suoi Chau Pha, on the morning of the 6th of August, they implemented this doctrine with the discipline of professionals who had been fighting this war since before many of the Australians had finished secondary school. Grenades landed between the 2 forces. Short automatic bursts cut through the undergrowth in both directions. The dead began to accumulate on both sides. both forces went to ground and began the brutal arithmetic of a close-range jungle firefight, where the calculations are simple and merciless. Who has more ammunition? Who has better cover? Who has the cooler nerve? And who has artillery accurate enough to use at a range that should be impossible? Sergeant Alexander Sutherland was already moving through 2 platoons' position when the full weight of the contact developed. A Scot who had served with the British Army in Korea before enlisting in the Australian Regular Army in February of 1961, Sutherland had spent 6 years working his way through the ranks before joining the 7th Battalion in January of 1967. He had only been reposted to 2 platoon as its platoon sergeant in July, just weeks before the battle. Before that, he had been the battalion's regimental police sergeant, performing that duty with what the records describe as conscientiousness and efficiency. He was not a glamorous figure. He was a professional soldier of the old school, the kind of man who had learned that the most important thing an NCO can do in a firefight is not shoot accurately, but keep the men around him functional. Now he was moving through 2 platoons' position under fire, not firing himself, but repeatedly exposing himself to the machine gun rounds cutting through the canopy, reassuring the wounded, directing the fire of the men still capable of fighting toward the enemy's strong points. It was the act of a man who had decided, at some point in his career that preceded all of this, that the morale of the soldiers around him mattered more than his own survival. He kept doing it, again and again, moving and exposing himself, and moving again, until a Viet Cong 40mm rocket exploded within 1 meter of his position. Sutherland went down. His left leg and left eye were destroyed in the blast. The men around him would carry that image for the rest of their lives, at the back of every quiet moment, at the front of every August. The battle could not pause for it. The firing continued at close range, and the wounded continued to accumulate, and the grenades continued to arc through the undergrowth, and the rain that was now beginning to fall made everything heavier and louder and harder to see. There was no time to absorb the full weight of what had happened. That reckoning would come later, much later. Private Dennis Bathersby, 2 platoons machine gunner, was wounded in the right arm during the same sequence of fighting. He kept firing. When the wound made the right arm unreliable, he threw grenades left-handed. 2 of them. He then dragged a wounded comrade to safety before withdrawing to the rear when his arm went completely numb. He was mentioned in dispatches. His comrades believed, in the sincere and unsentimental way soldiers sometimes arrive at these assessments without any assistance from the official system, that the decoration was insufficient. Private Keith Downward was the platoon's forward scout. At the height of the close-range fighting, with a Viet Cong machine gun position killing Australians from 10 meters away, Downward made a decision that the official citation would describe with the precise understatement of military bureaucracy as having demonstrated complete disregard for his own safety. He crawled through the undergrowth alone, moving toward the gun rather than away from it, closing the distance until he was at 10 meters. Then he stood up. He charged the position. He killed the operator and captured the weapon. He was wounded by a grenade almost immediately afterward. He dragged a wounded comrade clear of the fire before allowing himself to be evacuated. The military medal citation recorded the facts of what he had done. The citation could not record what it looked like to the men who watched him stand up. O'Donnell, directing the battle from the forward position he had moved to beside 2 platoon, understood that the enemy was not a squad and not a patrol and not a platoon. A full company, at minimum, with possibly more strength in the area beyond. He committed one platoon under 2nd Lieutenant Rod Smith to a right flanking attack using 2 platoon for fire support, with the objective of finding and turning the enemy's exposed flank before the enemy could consolidate its position on the high ground. Smith was briefed quickly and moved. 1 platoon lined up with 2 sections forward and 1 in reserve, and began its movement at approximately 11:30 in the morning. They advanced with the careful deliberation of men who had been told the enemy was to their front and intended to find it on their own terms. Section commanders directed their men from fire position to fire position, maintaining spacing, maintaining noise discipline, maintaining the professional focus that training builds over years of practice. 50 meters gained through the jungle. Another 50 meters. They reached the ground opposite 2 platoons' right flank, in position for the attack, and then from the north. Not from the enemy already in contact, but from an entirely new direction that nobody had anticipated. Heavy and accurate fire erupted from a 2nd Viet Cong platoon that had been conducting the identical flanking maneuver from the opposite direction. Both assault groups had gone for the same ground. Both had arrived at the same moment. The collision was total and catastrophic for both. Section Commander Corporal Aylett was shot and killed, leading his men forward. Section Commander Corporal Hayes was so focused on getting his section into firing positions and protecting his men that he left himself entirely exposed to a machine gun positioned approximately 10 yards away. Private Des Burley, who watched it happen from nearby, said later that Hayes never fired a single shot himself. He was so intent on his section that he forgot about his own position entirely. The machine gun burst killed him before he could return fire. Within the first minutes of the collision on the high ground, 12 men in 1 platoon were wounded, 2 section commanders were dead, and Rod Smith reported to O'Donnell that he could not advance. He was ordered to hold his position and use fire and movement to withdraw any exposed men back into a coherent defensive line. The battle had expanded far beyond what a single company engagement had any right to be. 7 Viet Cong light machine guns faced 6 Australian M60s at 30 meters range. Both sides were throwing grenades. Both sides had taken casualties that, in any ordinary tactical calculation, would have justified withdrawal. Neither side withdrew. Then the monsoon arrived. The rain came as tropical monsoons come, not gradually, but all at once. A wall of warm water descending through the canopy with the force of something deliberate. Visibility dropped further. Speech above the combined noise of rain and automatic fire and exploding grenades became impossible. Radio communications degraded as moisture worked its way into connections and contacts. Smoke grenades thrown to mark positions for the aircraft circling above refused to rise in the wet air, hanging uselessly in the undergrowth, drifting sideways and achieving nothing. The mud deepened under the feet of men who had been in continuous contact for nearly an hour. The physical weight of wet clothing and equipment, already significant after a morning of movement through primary jungle in the wet season, became something that had to be consciously overcome with every step, every movement, every decision. What the rain could not extinguish was the sound of the enemy communicating with each other across the gap. The Viet Cong issued and received orders in near silence. Whistles, short, precise signals, followed by low voices that carried no further than the men they were meant to reach. No shouting, no raised voices. Their fire control remained precise even through the monsoon and the chaos of a 2-platoon contact. Their movements remained coordinated. The Australians were trained to shout orders in contact, volume being the instinctive response to urgency and the noise of battle, and every command a company issued was audible to the enemy across the gap. Lieutenant Colonel Smith would later record this asymmetry in his after-action report with the directness of a commander who understood that professional embarrassment was less important than preventing future casualties. The Viet Cong method of whistling and communicating in low tones was demonstrably superior to the Australian practice of shouting, and he recommended that units train to change it. The Army filed the recommendation. The date was 1967. Through the rain and the noise and the accumulating cost of the battle, Lieutenant Neville Clark was directing artillery. Clark was a Citizens Military Force officer, part of the reserve rather than the regular army. The man responsible for the most critical fire support of the entire engagement had arrived in Vietnam not as a career soldier with combat tours in his record, but as a trained professional who had learned his craft in exercises and then found himself applying it in a monsoon firefight with 2 platoons of Australians in serious trouble on either side of his position. He was directing fire from the 106th Field Battery at Fire Support Base Giraffe, guns positioned over 10,000 meters away and approaching their 11,000-meter maximum effective range. At that distance, the margins for correction on the range card were thin to the point of being almost theoretical. Every adjustment he made was working at the outermost edge of what the howitzers could reliably deliver under any conditions, let alone in a monsoon with an artillery observer lying in the mud with the enemy 30 meters away. He brought the fire into 400 meters from Australian positions, then to 250. The rounds fell among the enemy with effects that Clark recorded in his diary later that night, with the odd clinical precision of a man who had stayed professional long past the point where professionalism was the natural response to what he was experiencing. The enemy could be heard. He noted this. The battle continued. Then came the moment that Clark would carry in his memory for the rest of his life. A moment that would return in the years after the war in ways he could not predict and could not prevent. He gave a fire mission. The command post at the guns transmitted the standard ranging report, the signal that a round was about to fall. Clark did not answer immediately. The signaler repeated it. The shells arrived before he could respond with a correction. Not near the enemy, in the Australian position. One round struck a tree and detonated in the canopy above the men below, sending steel fragments downward through the leaves at head height. From one platoon's radio came the transmission that cut through every other sound on the net. "Stop the artillery. Stop it now." Clark stopped the guns. He sat in the mud with the enemy 30 meters away, and the voices of his own wounded in the radio handset, and the rain coming through the canopy above him. And he asked himself the question that would not leave him for years afterward. If only he had dropped 25 meters on that last correction. If only. Perhaps the final ranging round had been muffled by the rain and had sounded closer than it actually fell. Perhaps the arithmetic of directing artillery in a firefight had produced, for one critical second, a calculation his hands had acted on before his mind could verify it. He would never know with certainty. What he knew, with a certainty that required no calculation, was that his rounds had wounded his own men. The enemy was still 30 meters away, and the battle was not over. He added 200 meters to the range and ordered battery fire for effect, without hesitation. The guns fired again. Outside the Australian perimeter, The Viet Cong commander was reading the situation with the professional clarity of a man who had been fighting this kind of war for a long time. The artillery was causing casualties among his withdrawing elements. The Australian perimeter was holding despite the losses it had taken. The flanking movements had not broken the position. But the mission had been accomplished. The battalion whose withdrawal C-12 Company had been tasked to protect had been given the time it needed to move. One final option remained available under the belt-buckle doctrine: mass the available strength for a direct assault on the Australian perimeter, closing the distance to the point where any further artillery use became a threat to the Australians themselves. The Viet Cong began forming for the charge, men rising from cover, moving forward through the undergrowth, closing the distance, 25 meters, 20 meters. O'Donnell saw it. Clark saw it. The mathematics of the next 30 seconds were entirely clear and entirely merciless. If the assault reached the perimeter, the Australians would be overwhelmed by numbers. If the artillery fired at the range required to stop the assault, the rounds would land inside the Australian position. These were not two separate problems. They were the same problem, and there was only one answer that addressed it. Clark adjusted the guns to 50 meters from his own location. Not 100 meters, not 75, 50 meters. A distance at which the kill radius of a 105mm high explosive shell and the position of the men calling for the fire shared the same circle on any map drawn to any scale. The standard American minimum safe distance for calling artillery was 300 meters. That was the doctrine. That was the rule. Clark was asking the 106th Field Battery, positioned over 10,000 meters away at the near edge of their maximum range, to place high explosive rounds 50 meters from the men he was lying beside in the mud. He was asking because the alternative was not a tactical reversal. The alternative was the end of A Company. The guns fired. The rounds arced over 10,000 meters of Vietnamese jungle and monsoon sky, and fell among the Viet Cong assault troops as they rose to charge. The effect was immediate. Soldiers who had been moving forward were stopped permanently. The assault that had been building for minutes ceased in seconds. The charge was broken before it reached the Australian line. In the diminishing fire that followed, the Viet Cong commander gave the withdrawal order. The withdrawal was executed with the same discipline that had characterized everything the enemy had done throughout the 4-hour battle. They fell back in coordinated movement, maintaining suppressive fire to the last, covering the retreat of each element before the next moved. They were professionals in withdrawal as they had been professionals in attack. And as they moved north through the shredded jungle, they took their dead with them, every soldier they could reach, every man they could carry. This was not only a tactical decision to deny the Australians an accurate body count, though it served that purpose effectively. It was something older and more absolute than any tactical calculation, a cultural and human obligation that ran deeper than military doctrine and deeper than orders. The Vietnamese obligation to return the dead to their families, to ensure that the spirits of the fallen could be properly honored in the traditions that Vietnamese families had observed for centuries, was not something that ceased at the edge of a firefight. The Viet Cong dead were their brothers and their fathers and their sons, and their surviving comrades were going to bring them home from this jungle, regardless of what the artillery was still doing nearby. What the Australian sweep teams found, when the guns finally fell silent, were 5 bodies, soldiers the withdrawing force could not reach because the ground around them was too exposed and the impact zones too recent. Around those 5 bodies were drag marks and blood trails extending north through the undergrowth, a record written in mud and blood of everyone else who had been carried away. The belt-buckle doctrine had almost worked. The Viet Cong had nearly neutralized the artillery entirely. The 50 meters that Clark had called had been the difference, and that difference had cost the enemy heavily. The cost on the Australian side was being counted simultaneously in the only currency that ultimately matters in any engagement. Squadron leader Jim Cox, known to his crews as Big Jim, had been airborne with No. 9 Squadron's Iroquois helicopters before the battle was over, flying casualty evacuation through active enemy ground fire. The enemy was still shooting at anything that moved. Cox's aircraft was hit 11 times on the first approach run. He and an orderly on board were both wounded. The damage destroyed the aircraft's winch mechanism. Cox landed the machine on the nearest available ground, 11 bullet holes in the airframe, and 2 wounded crew members aboard, and then directed the continued evacuation of Australian casualties by radio from the ground, talking each of the other helicopters in and out of the clearing while the fighting continued nearby. 5 more RAAF Iroquois completed the evacuation under the same conditions. Captain Tony Williams, the battalion's medical officer, was lowered directly into the contact site by winch to treat the most critically wounded Australians before they could survive the move to a landing zone. The RAAF and the battalion's medical personnel performed their part of this battle with the same order of courage as the infantrymen, in conditions that offered rather less protection. Sergeant Alexander Sutherland arrived at the 1st Australian Field Hospital at Vung Tau without a pulse. That sentence deserves to stand alone for a moment, because what follows it is one of the most extraordinary accounts of human endurance and human character to emerge from the entire Australian experience in Vietnam. The wounds were so extensive that even changing his bandages required general anesthesia. Every dressing change, every single one. Blood transfusions were given repeatedly over the first hours. Medicine and the particular quality of refusal that resides in certain human beings worked together on a man who had effectively died in the jungle beside the Suoi Chau Pha. The surgeons removed what could not be saved. Within 12 hours of surgery, Sergeant Sutherland sat up in his hospital bed and wrote 2 letters home. He then spent his recovery in the ward, moving among the other wounded, encouraging them, reassuring the frightened, keeping the morale of the ward high by the example of his own conduct, performing in a hospital bed the same function he had been performing in the firefight when the rocket found him. When General Westmoreland visited the hospital on his regular rounds through the Allied wards, he reached Sutherland's bedside and encountered something that clearly moved him beyond the ordinary register of such visits. He formally recommended Sergeant Alexander Sutherland for the Congressional Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration the United States government has ever created, reserved only for conspicuous gallantry at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty in action against an enemy of the United States. The recommendation was declined. The Medal of Honor cannot be awarded to a foreign national. This is not a loophole or an oversight. It is a rule. Westmoreland wrote personally to Sutherland's sister, expressing his admiration for her brother's heroism and his genuine regret at the technicality that made the award impossible. Sutherland received the Distinguished Conduct Medal, one of the highest decorations in the Commonwealth military tradition. A medal discontinued in 1993 and awarded only 2,071 times in the history of the Australian Army. It was the right award. It was not the one Westmoreland believed he had earned. B Company, inserted by helicopter to blocking positions to the north, made no contact. The Viet Cong were gone, moving through the jungle with the efficiency that had characterized every decision they had made that day. The following morning, B Company located a freshly vacated battalion-sized camp in the jungle, less than a kilometer from the contact site. The cooking fires were cold, but only recently so. Rice was still warm in the pots, enough to feed 50 men, abandoned in the hours following the battle. The camp was large enough for a battalion headquarters. It explained everything that A Company had not been told before they walked into the Hat Dich. C-12 Company had not blundered into the Australians by accident. They had been the forward screen for a battalion headquarters, positioned less than a kilometer behind them. A headquarters that needed time to move, and they had been prepared to pay whatever price was required to buy that time. They had paid it. 6 Australians died as a direct consequence of how effectively they performed their mission. Lieutenant Colonel Smith wrote to his men in the battalion newsletter without reducing the cost or inflating the victory. 6 killed, 19 wounded. A price, he wrote, exacted in fighting for the principles they believed in. He said they could be proud of those who had made the final sacrifice. He said that every man in A Company had contributed to the victory of Suoi Chau Pha, and that it was a victory of which all could be proud. These are the words a commanding officer writes when there is nothing adequate that can be said and something must be said regardless, when the weight of what has happened exceeds the capacity of language to carry it, and the best available option is precision and honesty, and a refusal to diminish what it cost. He also filed an after-action report, and in that report he documented with precision and without apology every tactical lesson the battle had exposed. Section-level radios were absolutely necessary and should be obtained at once because, without the ability to communicate at the section level in a close contact, commands could not be passed quickly enough through a platoon to make any difference to the outcome. The Viet Cong whistle signal system was demonstrably superior to the Australian practice of shouting orders in contact, and units should be trained to use equivalent methods. The M79 grenade launcher, carried by several soldiers as their primary weapon, had failed repeatedly to arm in dense jungle foliage, a significant tactical liability in exactly the kind of close-range fighting the 6th of August had produced. Smith identified each failure with the specificity of a man who had decided that what went wrong at Suoi Chau Pha must not go wrong in the next battle, and the battle after that, and all the battles that the Army would fight in the years that followed this one. The Army filed his recommendations. Section-level radios for Australian infantry battalions were eventually acquired through a project given the designation Pintail in 1993. 26 years after Smith wrote the words should be obtained at once. The words are still visible in the archived report. The date of the eventual acquisition is also on record. The distance between them is a measurement of something that no tactical recommendation has ever successfully changed about large institutions. 8 Australians received gallantry awards for their actions on the 6th of August, 1967. Military crosses to Major O'Donnell, Lieutenant Clark, and 2nd Lieutenant Ross. The Distinguished Conduct Medal to Sergeant Sutherland. Military medals to Private Downward and others. Mentions in dispatches to Corporal Tredrea and Corporal Bathersby. The Distinguished Flying Cross to Squadron Leader Cox. The concentration of decorations in a single company action lasting 4 hours speaks, without any commentary being required, to what those men were asked to do and to the quality of what they chose to give when the asking came. There is another story embedded in the official account of the aftermath, one that the 7RAR historical record tells with a directness and honesty unusual in unit histories. Private Rick Brown was wounded at Suoi Chau Pha and evacuated to the U.S. 36th Evacuation Hospital at Vung Tau to recover from his wounds. While he was regaining consciousness, his camera and the rest and recreation money he had drawn for the leave he expected to take within days were stolen by persons never identified. He received no visitors during his recovery. He received no debriefing of any kind about the battle he had fought, or the men who had fought it beside him. When the battalion returned to Australia and marched through Sydney in the celebration of its homecoming, Private Brown was not invited to join the march. The unit's own official history, not an external critic, not a newspaper, but the battalion's own published record of its service, states with the bluntness of a verdict long deferred that the military often did little to thank those who had sacrificed most in its service. To its shame. Those 4 words appear in the record. They have not been amended or qualified in any subsequent edition. These 2 stories, Smith's recommendations filed and forgotten for a generation, and Brown's exclusion from his own battalion's homecoming parade, are not marginal footnotes in the history of Suoi Chau Pha. They are what the battle revealed about the institution that sent those men into the jungle. The tactical failure that preceded the battle and the moral failure that followed it share a common origin, an institution confident enough in its own adequacy that it did not feel the obligation to listen carefully to the evidence that its confidence was misplaced. There is a battle that every Australian knows. Long Tan, August the 18th, 1966. 18 Australians dead, 245 Viet Cong killed, a single company holding off a full regiment until reinforcements arrived. It has been commemorated, contested, politically argued over, and culturally elevated to the status of a national story. It is the Australian-Vietnam War in its most compressed and transmissible form. Overwhelming odds, impossible survival, a result that appears to confirm something essential and reassuring about Australian soldiers when the situation is most desperate. Suoi Chau Pha is not that story. It has no overwhelming odds and no miraculous survival. What it offers instead is something more historically accurate and, in some ways, more demanding of genuine respect. 2 professional forces of equal size and equal capability meeting in a monsoon and fighting each other to a standstill until the artillery broke the equilibrium. Company against company. Professional against professional. Equal against equal. Decided by 50 meters and the nerve of one forward observer who understood the mathematics completely and made the call in full knowledge of what those mathematics meant for the men lying beside him. Not because it was safe, because the alternative was certain. That kind of victory is harder to mythologize than a miracle. It is harder to build a ceremony around. It does not lend itself to the language of the impossible overcome. It requires, instead, the language of the possible executed perfectly under conditions designed to make perfection impossible. That language is harder to find and harder to use, and less satisfying to the part of human nature that wants its heroes to have faced odds that could not be beaten and beaten them regardless. Suoi Chau Pha is less remembered than Long Tan because its story does not provide that satisfaction. It is no less honorable for that. It may, in fact, be more honest. The men who came home from this battle returned to an Australia that was becoming rapidly and vocally hostile to the war they had fought. Barry Hurd arrived back in Melbourne, began attending university, and encountered what many veterans of that era found waiting for them: a community that had decided that the uniform was a political statement rather than the consequence of a lottery barrel, and treated the men who wore it as representatives of a policy they had never been asked about and had no power to change. He began to drink. He worked himself to exhaustion, not because the work was productive, but because exhaustion was the only reliable path to sleep, and sleep was the only reliable interruption to the thoughts that came in the quiet. Crowded places became difficult to navigate without anxiety. His health deteriorated over years. He describes the long period between his return from Vietnam and his eventual collapse as years of managed concealment, the daily work of keeping the intrusions of memory from surfacing at moments when he could not afford to examine them. He used every strategy available to him. Eventually, he ran out of strategies. He collapsed. What came after the collapse, the long process of acknowledging what had happened and then attempting to describe it in language that other people could read, produced the memoir he published in 2005 under the title "Well Done, Those Men." He had begun writing only 5 years before publication, encouraged to continue by fellow veterans who read early drafts of the manuscript and found in it their own experience described with a clarity and honesty they had not known how to achieve for themselves. The book was studied in Australian schools. It received serious critical attention. It remains the most important human document to emerge from the Battle of Suoi Chau Pha, and it was written by the man who carried the radio. The Suoi Chau Pha today is a creek in a province where the jungle has reclaimed the clearings that artillery made in August of 1967. The craters are filled with 50 years of new growth. The blood trails are gone, washed away by 50 monsoon seasons. There is no plaque on the northern bank where Corporal Tredrea's section lay waiting in the undergrowth. No marker at the crossing point where 2 platoon found the fresh footprints in the mud. The location does not appear on tourist maps. The name exists in the official history in pages that most Australians have never opened, and in the comments thread of a Veterans Association website where families are still posting, decades later, small pieces of a story that was never fully told while the men who lived it were young enough to tell it. In Townsville, at Laverack Barracks, the accommodation lines of the 4th Field Regiment are named Suoi Chau Pha lines. A quiet tribute, an unglamorous one. Artillery barracks named for an artillery battle, honoring the guns that saved a company with the kind of memorial that the men who were there would recognize immediately for what it was, and that most civilians would walk past without pausing to wonder about. It is the right kind of memorial for this battle, understated, precise, present without demanding attention. Private Leif Harstad had written to his parents 4 days before the battle that he thought he could handle it. "The lieutenant thinks I can handle it," he wrote, "and anyway, it will be good practice for my upcoming officer training." He was right. By every account of what happened on the 6th of August, 1967, the soldiers of A Company, the regulars and the conscripts together, the men who had chosen soldiering, and the men whose birthdays had come up in a barrel were equal to what was asked of them. They held their positions under fire that should have broken them. They trusted the man beside them. They did not stop. Adequate is not a word that sounds like praise until you understand what it means to remain adequate when everything around you is designed to make adequacy impossible. The creek is still there. The names on the honor roll are still there. The comments thread on the 7RAR Association website is still open and still receiving new entries. Sons and daughters posting decades later about a grandfather who went quiet in August every year, about a father who never mentioned Fuak Tui even when directly asked, about a grandmother whose face changed on Anzac Day in a way that the family understood was connected to something they were not permitted to ask about. Veterans posting in the plain and careful language of men who have finally decided in the later years of their lives that it can be said now. Jack Higgins, who was at company headquarters on the 6th of August and dragged Speedy O'Connor back from the gun position, wrote it simply. All I think about that day is the bravery of the platoon members and the loss of those courageous KIA. That is the whole sentence. It is enough. That is what the battle left behind. Not monuments and not annual ceremonies and not a long political argument about the appropriate date on which to hold the commemoration. Just the knowledge, carried by fewer and fewer people as the years pass, of what happened beside a stream in Phuoc Tuy province on a morning in August when the rain came in and two armies found each other in the jungle and neither one would break first. More than 50 years have passed since the 6th of August, 1967. The official histories acknowledge Suoi Chau Pha. The barracks in Townsville bears its name. 8 gallantry awards speak to what the men who fought there were asked to give and chose to give. Somewhere in the records, there is a formal recommendation signed by the commander of United States Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, that an Australian sergeant be awarded the highest military honor in America. It was declined on a technicality. The sergeant had arrived at the hospital without a pulse. 12 hours after losing a leg and an eye, he sat up and wrote 2 letters home. The Battle of Suoi Chau Pha was never secret, never classified, never suppressed or hidden or deliberately removed from the record. It was a battle fought by competent, courageous, ordinary people, some of whom chose to be soldiers and some of whom did not. That did not fit the shape of the stories a nation prefers to tell about its wars. No miracle, no impossible odds. Company against company, professional against professional, decided by 50 meters and the nerve of one man with a radio and a range card, and the knowledge that there was no option remaining that did not carry a cost that was very close to unacceptable. He made the call. The guns fired. A company survived. You came to this video not knowing that name. You leave knowing it. Tell me in the comments whether you had heard of this battle before today, and if you have a connection to 7RAR, to Phuoc Tuy province, or to anyone who served in Operation Ballarat, share it below. These stories belong to all of us, and every name recovered from the silence is one fewer name forgotten. The battle was never told, until now.